This is Owen Bennett-Jones. Thanks for downloading this podcast of Newshour Extra. And this week, it's a topic we don't often do on the BBC World Service. You'd think we would, but it's Eritrea. And Piers Lynch, producer, came up with this idea, basically because you've been looking at the migrant stories, which were mainly about Syrians. But, of course, a substantial number didn't come from Syria.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary amount of people. After Syria and Afghanistan, it's Eritrea. It's a tiny country. It's like 6 million people. And you have this number of 5,000 people every single month fleeing the country in the hope of a better life, mostly ending up in camps in Sudan and in Ethiopia. But a huge amount of people also braving the most dangerous migratory route to Europe in the world, which is the one from Libya to Lampedusa, that incredibly treacherous stretch of water that this year alone is 3,000 people have died.
Yeah, so lots of migrants taking really significant risks to get to Europe. And I mean, you have some sensitivity to this. You've lived in Africa a long time.
I lived in East Africa for a short amount of time, and I go there often.
Okay.
Probably fair to say.
All right. And so just talk us through Eritrea. It matters because of the migrants and because of its extraordinary history.
Yeah, it's this second youngest country in Africa. They fought a David and Goliath civil war in order to win independence from Ethiopia with absolutely zero backing or support from the international community. And it's this hard-won freedom also seems to have, given the regime a hard-won bitterness in the way that they were treated historically, colonially, and also in the lack of support given to them once they became an independent nation.
Right. So it's a very interesting discussion, and that's the subject of this week's podcast, Eritrea. BBC World Service, you're listening to Newshour Extra with Owen Bennett-Jones, and amidst all the stories about migrants coming to Europe, you will have heard much talk about the Syrians fleeing the war there, but also maybe mention of Eritreans. It's a small place. It's a country at peace, its economy is in reasonable shape, and yet each month thousands of Eritreans risk their lives trying to escape, and that's despite the best efforts of the regime to man the borders. So what's going on? What's happening in Eritrea? We'll be discussing that over the next hour, and our panel today, Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud, he's chairman of the British Eritrean Community Organisation and Network, so that's BCON, and it's an umbrella organisation of 45 Eritrean communities here in the UK. He's with us in the studio here in London, as is Firuz Weredeh, human rights activist, also originally from Eritrea. She came here, she says, when she was in her early 20s. In America, from Washington, we have Bronwyn Bruton, who's Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Centre, and recently back from Eritrea, where I think you met the President, didn't you, Bronwyn?
I did.
We'll talk about that. And in Athens, Ohio, we have Girmay Nagash, who's Professor of English and African Literature at Ohio University. So I think it would help if we I just ask all four of you just to give your take on the current state of Eritrea, what's going on in Eritrea, how you understand the state of the country, if you like. And Bronwyn Bruton, since you've just been there, why don't you give us your understanding of the current state of Eritrea?
Sure. I have worked around Africa my entire career and was born and raised on the continent. And I have to say that Eritrea is one of the most perplexing and confusing countries that I've encountered. I would be lying if I told you that I had a strong idea of what was happening there right now. I think that it's a country that really extraordinary. I think that unlike many of the other countries of the Horn of Africa, it is at peace, as you said, and it is a country that is surprisingly not corrupt. It's a country that is striving to create educational systems, health systems, is ahead of some of the Millennial Development Goals, which is a significant accomplishment. But it's also a country that suffered profoundly from war. And in consequence, there are genuine problems there. Problems that in some respects are as severe as the ones that you would find across the border in South Sudan, where 80,000 people have died recently, or in Somalia, which has been an anarchy for more than 20 years. What I think you see in Eritrea is a sort of an iron-fisted determination to succeed, which can occasionally be very, very hard on its people, and particularly its youth.
So let's now go to Firuz Weredeh for your opening set of remarks on the state of the country.
I will agree with the fact that there's no war there. However, when you look at the country, also when you speak to people that actually leave the country, what they will tell you is, and what we know is that there is arbitrary arrest, human rights abuse, never-ending national service, which we call the slavery, freedom of expression, religious persecution, and lack of constitution, which results in the country being ruled by fear and not law.
So you're saying the problems basically are internal, not external. That's a good opening statement, if you like, from your perspective. And let's get another sort of general view from Girmay Nagash. How do you see the current state? When were you last there, actually, or do you go back or not?
I did not go back at the moment because I was working at the University of Asmara until 2005. And the University of Asmara was dismantled, shut down by the government decree in 2005, and that is precisely the reason why I left in search of new employment.
OK, let's now bring in Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud here in London, representing an umbrella organisation of Eritrean communities in the UK, and I think you're quite sympathetic to the government in Eritrea. So what's your take on where it's going?
Eritrea is a peaceful country. There is no conflict. Actually, the population of Eritrea is 50 Christians and 50 Muslims.
50-50.
Yeah, but the people live in harmony and unity of purpose in peace.
Yeah, but I guess the point is people are trying to get out. They're fleeing.
Yeah, I understand that. But there are a couple of challenges which Eritreans as a whole face. There is sanction which is against Eritrea. As a consequence of those sanctions, there is no investment, and therefore this lack of investment makes one wonder what to do, and sometimes, I mean, the youth might decide to go out of the country. And the second part, we shouldn't forget as well, like 300 or 400,000 Ethiopian arms which are stationed in the border. It is an occupation, and which each time they threaten to ignite a war.
Bronwyn Bruton, can you just explain to us the status of that border issue or the occupation issue? What happened? What is its current status?
Sure. So basically, Ethiopia and Eritrea went to war in 1998 over a fairly small slice of the border. The key town is a town called Badame. You know, it's very small. It's not a strategic location. It's of great symbolic importance. And basically, after the fighting wore down, the international community stepped in and tried to mediate the border dispute, who owned what. And this International Border Commission, backed by the US, the UN, the UK, all of the powers, found in favor of Eritrea. And they said that Badame belonged to Eritrea.
But this occupation is literally of a tiny place.
It's of a tiny place, and it's of a tiny slice of the border. It's important for a number of reasons. You know, basically, Ethiopia itself is quite unstable. It's governed by the Tigrayan ethnic minority. They're about 6% of the population. And the leader, Meles Zenawi, who was Prime Minister of Ethiopia for more than 2 decades, he is blamed for losing Eritrea, basically because he agreed to Eritrean independence. And when he did that, he lost Ethiopian access to its only port, which had heavy economic consequences. And so this insistence on keeping their footprint on Badame is really a sign of the ongoing tensions between the two countries. It's not just about a tiny town that really has no importance in and of itself. It's about the wider instability in the Horn of Africa, the tensions that you see between newly formed countries that are small and their bigger, stronger, older counterparts. But it all centers on the symbolic value of this town of Badame.
Well, that helps us understand where your basic positions. Let's just get a bit of a primer on Eritrea now, a bit of an introduction. What happened during that struggle for independence? Who are the leadership? What do they believe in? The basics, as it were. And our guide is the BBC's Alex Last, who was a BBC correspondent in Eritrea. I think I'm right in saying he's the longest-standing foreign correspondent ever in Eritrea. And so here's his brief sort of snapshot of the history.
In many ways, Eritrea has been defined by its struggle for independence. A small former Italian colony on the Red Sea, in the early 1960s, it was annexed by Ethiopia, its powerful, landlocked southern neighbour. And although the two countries share culture and history, in the end many Eritreans wanted their own country. The odds were not good. Ethiopia's huge occupying army was backed first by the United States and then by the Soviet Union. Yet, for 30 years, the Eritrean rebels fought on.
Now the Eritreans are calling in their reserve forces. Hundreds more streaming over the defences. Showered with dirt there by a bomb that...
Hundreds of thousands of Eritreans fled in those years. While in the field, one Eritrean rebel group became supreme. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF, a left-wing, secular, highly disciplined force where women fought alongside the men. In its mountainous base, it built underground schools and hospitals. It grew stronger, capturing weapons from the Ethiopian armies. And by 1991, against incredible odds, the EPLF won control of Eritrea.
We are proud as Eritreans. We are proud, and we feel these conditions will continue forever.
At the same time, Ethiopian rebels allied to the EPLF managed to take power in Ethiopia, so in theory all was well between the two countries. Eritrea became independent, and the EPLF's young leader, Isaias Afwerki, became president.
A lot of damage has been done in a very long war. We believe this conclusion is a good lesson for many to look for political and peaceful solutions to conflicts and political problems rather than use force to suppress wishes of populations.
The EPLF was now in government, and although Eritrea was a one-party state, there was hope and optimism. President Isaias spoke of democracy.
Definitely the formation of political parties will take time, but we need to have democratic institutions above anything else in this country. Politics of organizations or associations will come later on. When that atmosphere is created, when there is law and the rule of law in this country, political parties will have enough opportunity to be active and operational.
But then, in 1998, everything was put on hold. The old allies had become enemies. Eritrea and Ethiopia fought a new 2-year-long border war. Tens of thousands were killed. In Eritrea, the lack of democracy at home and the conduct of the war led to unprecedented public criticism of the president, Isaias Afwerki, including from former top liberation fighters. Isaias hit back. In September 2001, he arrested the dissidents, arguing that they were traitors.
These are people who've betrayed their nation in difficult times. When war breaks out, the top general declares surrender. What do you do with that? When people work for foreign governments, paid or not paid, that again is not politics, it's treason.
At the same time, Isaias shut the private press and locked up leading journalists. None have been seen since. Opposition is banned, and Eritrea has been described as a police state. Since independence, Eritrea has had national service for men and women, in part because its population is tiny compared to its neighbours. And for the 1998 war, all were called up. But instead of fully demobilising when peace came, each year more men and women are drafted. In effect, for some, national service has become indefinite, a source of cheap labour for the state. And unsurprisingly, many young Eritreans want to leave. And on top of it all, the economy has tanked. Isaias Afwerki, now 69 years old, remains in power, supported by loyal generals. But opposition to his regime has grown, most visibly in the diaspora. The question now is how long all this can last.
And that was Alex Last from our history programme, Witness. Well, let's just start with you, perhaps, Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud. Do you accept that basic history that, you know, there was this time in the early 90s of great hope and that it's gone away?
No, still there's hope. I mean, that's the thing which bonds us as freedom, liberation, democracy, justice, unity and harmony in the country. And therefore, this is like a footnote of history. The one we see is because of the aggressive nature of our neighbor. And our histories teach us to be vigilant and alert. And that's why we see like a state of emergency situation in Eritrea. When states are faced with danger, then you take extreme measures and you take tough measures as well. I mean, it's not easy for the country. Yeah.
All right. Let's just go to Girmay Nagash in Ohio. Can you just give us a bit of the flavour of the early 90s and the hopes that were there at that time? Because it really was quite an exciting time, wasn't it? I mean, no one thought Eritrea would get independence in the first place, and then it achieved this against the odds. And there were many people who had high hopes at that time.
There was enthusiasm, euphoria. To add as well, there was solidarity, support for the new government from the international community as well. It was described at that time as the hope of Africa in many ways. The new government, the post-independence government led by President Isaias Afwerki, had good hopes for the country. In the clip he played, we heard the President Isaias mentioning really wonderful things about the promise of having a country that was governed by the rule of law, creation of a democratic society, allowing free elections with political parties, and so on and so forth.
And at that time, I think I'm right in saying there was quite a cultural flowering, wasn't there?
Yes, the Eritrea is a multilinguistic nation. The languages and the culture and the literature of the different ethnic groups was encouraged. Books were being published. So there was clearly hope and enthusiasm.
So, Farouz, you were in Eritrea at that time of independence and all the excitement. Can you just give us your take? You must be very young at that time. What was it like?
Yeah, I was very, very young. I was both my parents were fighters at the time, so therefore I was in the liberated land. I grew up in the liberated land. It was euphoria. What can I say? It was the happiest moment of our lives. We woke up in the middle of the night to fires being fired to the sky just to show how happy we were. There was no doubt in our minds in terms of who we were bringing as our government into the capital city. They were our heroes. As far as me and my counterparts and my peers, I could say that. They were our heroes, and they were going to lead us to this great life of bliss. That was what we had in mind. And it took us a while to understand that that wasn't the case.
Okay. Just before we end the first half of the programme, I'm going to try and get on to refugees. And as I was saying, the numbers are UNHCR saying Eritreans under its concern outside of the country, 357,000. And by the end of 2014, 80,000 were residing in the EU. We just actually spoke to an NGO in Ethiopia where there are many Eritreans, and they've been to a camp just yesterday, actually, and they say their impression is that they're younger and younger, the ones trying to get out. The numbers are from the IOM, just to put numbers on this year. First 8 months of 2015, 30,000 Eritreans arrived in Italy, nearly 3,000 died, and the Eritreans make up the largest group of those 3,000. Now, you would think it would be quite easy to speak to people who have made this journey, and many of whom are here in the UK. It isn't. We have approached charities, NGOs, radio stations, churches, all working with newly arrived Eritrean refugees in the UK, and they all said no one they could contact was willing to speak to us about why they left the country. We spoke actually to some young people now living in Israel, Eritreans. They thought they'd talk to us. They called it off. They all say they fear that if they speak to organisations like the BBC, then their families back home will have problems. Now, the BBC's Yalda Hakim went to Eritrea in March this year, and she did manage to get one interview with an Eritrean refugee in London. So here's a very brief comment from that refugee.
As part of my national service, I was working in fields belonging to military officers and working for their personal profit, not for the good of the country. I did national service from 1997 to 2007.
So it took 10 years?
Yeah.
But it's supposed to be for 18 months.
No. If it was 18 months, why would so many people leave the country, or drown in the sea, or die in the Sahara trying to get out? I am patriotic, and I was happy to work for 18 months, even 3 or 4 or 5 years, but not for the rest of my life.
So there we are, one refugee, no name, and his words, as you probably heard there, spoken by an actor. So the main reason, I mean, we're hearing various explanations as to why so many Eritreans are fleeing, but one of the main reasons given by the people who do it is that they are getting caught in national service, which is meant to last 18 months or something like that, and it can be sort of like 10, 15 years. They get stuck in the army. Tell us what you understand about the issue.
Like you said, yes, the national service goes on indefinitely. Young women or men at the age of 16, 17, what waits for them is the national service once they finish high school. Once they go into the national service, they are there until they are 40, 50 plus. There's no way out. Now, you mentioned that refugees in Ethiopia are getting younger and younger, and that is because they see what is happening to their neighbors, to their brothers, to their sisters, the fact that they are stuck in this never-ending national service where they can't make a living, they can't get married, they can't have children, they can't do anything with their life. They belong to the government. And because of that, before they hit the age of 16 or 17, at the age of 12, 13, let's say, they leave the country.
Now, would you accept that Eritrea has, as the international institutions all say, pretty good health indicators, that they're doing, lots of things that, and in a sort of self-reliant way, they are doing lots of things that the international community would ask them to do, like
yes.
Millennium Development Goals. But the explanation for the people leaving is this national service.
Yes, of course. And I'm not going to deny the fact that Eritrea is doing well on some aspects. The Millennium, for example, on health. But it cannot be at the cost of the people. The people cannot give in their entire life to the country. They do not belong to the country, to the government.
Just to wrap up this half now, but Mohammed Mahmoud, did you do national service?
No. But can I say something, though? I mean, just about these refugee issues and politicizing it does not help anyone. I mean, it's to say if a person crosses a border, call him a refugee, and if someone from the same area, you call him migrant. This politicizing, it does not help anyone.
But hang on. Just to be clear about this, many people come to this country appealing for asylum on fear of persecution, and they get it.
Just a second. Let me finish my point, though. I mean, for example, what we see around us is like people playing pure politics, creating camps around Ethiopia and Sudan so that anyone who crosses the border to be accepted there and to be introduced to human traffickers. You can see the same. Say, for example, last year, 150,000 Ethiopians were returned back to Ethiopia from Saudi Arabia, and they crossed through Yemen. And this is according to Ethiopian government figure I'm talking about. And yet people say like 500,000 or 1 million Ethiopians are in Yemen. But they don't call them refugee there. They call them migrant, illegal immigrant.
We'll pick that up. We'll pick that point up.
We need to have this.
Could I come in this, please?
Yes, okay, Professor, quickly, and then we're going to wrap up for a new summary. So, Professor, quickly.
I think there are good things in Eritrea. There are situations that need improvements, that need change. It is ironic to say, as we have been hearing from the gentleman and Brodin as well, that there are problems in Somalia, there are problems in Eritrea, there are problems in other parts of the world as well, and therefore the situation in Eritrea is justified. I think it's a sad irony to say these things. What Eritreans need at this particular moment of their history is they need to think about moving forward in terms of human rights, in terms even asking themselves, understanding and analyzing the situation, why people are leaving the country, and not create a kind of a narrative of denial saying, well, it is happening in France this way, it can happen in Eritrea as well. Or Ethiopia is not respecting its human rights with its journalists, so Eritrea is also allowed to do that. I think that is a bad line of reasoning.
We'll pick it up in a minute after the break. Just now we're about to take a break. Stay with us. In the second half of the programme, more on this issue of economic migration or seeking asylum, fear of persecution. Just to remind you, you can follow us on Twitter at BBC NH Extra. Send us an email, BBC NewsHour Extra, one word, at gmail.com. And we've got a podcast. Just put in BBC NewsHour Extra into your podcast provider or your search engine and it will take you there. You're listening to NewsHour Extra from the BBC World Service with Owen Bennett-Jones, and our panel today, we've got Mr. Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud, who's chairman of an umbrella group of community groups, Eritrean community groups in the UK. Farouz Warede, a human rights activist based in London, originally from Eritrea. From the United States, we've got Bronwyn Bruton, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Centre, and Professor Girmay Nagash in Ohio. Now, Bronwyn Bruton, can I just pick up with you on this issue of why people are leaving? Because there is an economic element to it, presumably, and a political element as well. How do you see that balance?
You know, it's tough. On the one hand, I think that the situation of Eritrea's youth is truly awful. There are no jobs for people to go to. The economy is in tatters. And it is absolutely understandable for people to want to leave Eritrea because of that. Part of the responsibility certainly lies with the government. Part of the responsibility lies with the conflict with Ethiopia and the international community's failure to resolve the Ethiopian occupation. It's a toxic mix. I will say that I am convinced that the Eritrean government wants to change the national service program. I think that one of the things that I would really like your listeners to understand is that they need help doing that. I don't think that it's reasonable to expect a government to demobilize large numbers of youth if they don't have jobs to go to. And I think that development and investment has to be a part of our expectations when we talk about ending the national service program. And it goes back to some of the comments that have been made about politicizing this. I hope that there will be less politicization and more, how do we change the situation? I think it would be useful for everyone.
But just on that point of international engagement to help get change, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, my impression was that the President Isaias, doesn't want help. I mean, his whole point is self-reliance. The United States, they've offered aid, it's been turned down. The Eritrean the government says it wants to do it its own way, doesn't it?
You know, it's one of the things that I admire and respect about the Eritrean government after having worked with many, many African governments over the years. They don't take orders from the West, from the U.S. They really have an idea of what they want done, and they insist on it. And in certain respects, that's very admirable. You know, I don't think that in this particular situation, it's serving them very well. You know, I personally would urge the government to take the assistance that's being offered, but it's not helpful.
When you put that, presumably you said that to the president when you met him recently, and if you say to him, look, engage, people want to help you, what did he say to you?
Well, I think one of the major problems is that there is not necessarily a belief in Asmara that the international community does want to help. You know, you've pointed out in this program that Eritrea had to fight for, almost 30 years to become independent because the world would not recognize the desire of the Eritrean people to be liberated from Ethiopia. It then fought a border war that was mediated in the end by an international border commission, which found that Eritrea was in the right in terms of the border, and the world has refused to enforce that. Eritrea was then sanctioned because of meddling in Somalia that frankly did far less harm than Ethiopia's meddling, but those sanctions remain, even though the international community in the form of the UN monitoring group has found that Eritrea is not meddling in Somalia anymore. So there are all of these points, essentially, that have persuaded Eritrea that when the international community gets engaged, it's not necessarily with good intentions. And it's the primary problem.
Okay, let me put that point.
And let's say the one.
Yeah, go on.
I
should just say this is Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud in London.
Yeah. What Eritrea refuses is like begging, and which is degrading, basically, not asking for help. I mean, Eritrea will ask for partnership with other countries to solve the problem we are facing inside Eritrea. I can give an example, a partnership that has been created with the European Union with regard to judicial system in Eritrea. For example, Eritrea needed to train judges, and she needed like capacity building on that area. And she approached the European Union, and they were helping. What we say is like we need to do our homework ourselves, and we don't want people, for example, to tell us what we need.
Farouz Baradi.
Okay, if the Eritrean government doesn't want the external community to tell them what to do, can you at least listen to its own people who are bleeding? The country is bleeding of its own people. The thing is, Eritrea and the border war and the sanctions are, as far as I'm concerned, two issues. There are many issues like the national service, the freedom of expression, religious persecution, lack of constitution, all these. And the fact is Eritrea cannot afford to have or to be a one-issue campaigner when there's so many issues going on in the country.
Perception and reality is different. I mean, you can perceive that there is this problem, that problem, and so on. I'm not denying there is issues inside Eritrea. I'm not saying there is no problem. It is paradise there. It is hell. There's some places there is a lot of problem, and we need to face and we need to change those ones. And our existence depends on listening to our people. And we have a system whereby it is like reacts to the needs of our own people.
Your people,
obviously, they haven't reacted.
5% have run away.
Again, the statistics. I can give you lots of statistics around those areas. I mean, run away, and it reminds me why during this farm struggle, people were telling us that Eritreans are fleeing outside, and we have this big Soviet Union side of Ethiopia, and you don't have any hope, and therefore we need to give up.
So what you're telling me?
It's not. We have a problem, and we are addressing them. I mean, even if this national service, if we think that it is harming our youth, we'll stop it.
There are people that have been in the national service for over 20 years. And these people are, if they went into the national service at the age of 20, they are 40 plus. Of course, it's harming the people. But the government is not listening. If you're telling me that the government is actually listening and reacting, then I'm sorry, we haven't seen it. The thing is, you brought up the fact that during the Civil War, there was many Eritreans leaving the country and we were told to give up. That was during Civil War. I will expect someone to tell me, give up on that country. But now we have got a government. We have got our freedom. There's no civil war. There's nothing going on. Yet there's 3,000 people leaving the country.
Let's take this out to Ohio. Professor.
I think Mr. Ahmed is making a valid point that the problem that Eritrea is facing is not happening in isolation. The Eritrean government, in general, I think the Eritrean population are despondent, even angry at the fact that the international community has been pressurizing the Eritrean government to do this and that, but not by shying away from addressing the border issue. That is playing in the background as well. Having said that, I think it would be more helpful for the Eritrean government, for Eritreans in the international community, to work more constructively in terms of promoting the rule of law, democratic governance, creation of a viable infrastructure for employment, so that the young people, the youth, do not run away from the country the way they are running at this moment.
Thank you for that. We've got this clip of President Obama. Now, he visited Eritrea's neighbour and rival, Ethiopia, in July this year, and he did a press conference there. And he was asked by a journalist from the Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation why America wasn't doing more to help combat groups in Eritrea and to help with Ethiopia's counter-terrorism, as they described it, counter-terrorism efforts. So basically, this is a journalist saying, why aren't you more helpful to Ethiopia? This is what Obama said.
We are opposed to any group that is promoting the violent overthrow of a government, including the government of Ethiopia that has been democratically elected. But what I indicated to the Prime Minister is that in our consultations and deepening intelligence cooperation, we will look and see what evidence we have, how we define a particular group's activities, and are operating as political organizations. We tend to be protective of them even if we don't agree with them.
OK, so the regional politics are quite complicated, but Bronwyn Bruton basically I think your point is, and it's rather sort of stood up by that the Americans are very much with Ethiopia, saying it's democratic, and it's not really democratic, is it? I mean, I think they had a 100% win for the ruling party in the last parliamentary elections, and from Eritrea's point of view, that could seem a little odd.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's hypocritical. And it comes down to the fact that the U.S. prioritizes counter-terror interests. And the U.S. has an idea, which I personally disagree with, that Ethiopia has been helpful in the war on terror. And that is more important than anything else. Eritrea is a small country. It is not participating in the war on terrorism. It's not useful to the U.S., and because of that, we're very happy to talk all day about human rights abuses there. It's not fair. It doesn't mean it's not right to talk about human rights abuses in Eritrea and in Ethiopia. We should. But again, there needs to be better balance, because the lack of balance is reinforcing Eritrean perceptions that the world is against them. And that's what's preventing help from going in there. That's what's preventing journalists from going in there. And I really believe that if we could solve these bad feelings, lift the sanctions on Eritrea over Somalia, help them to bring investment and jobs to the country, everybody would be better off, opposition and pro-government alike.
Can you spell out for us why those sanctions are in place?
The sanctions were put on because of a belief that has been demonstrated that at the time the Eritrean government was supporting groups that were sympathetic to the al-Shabaab insurgency, which has subsequently become linked with al-Qaeda. Now, Eritrea meddles in Ethiopian affairs. Ethiopia meddles in Eritrean affairs. Eritrea has been sanctioned for the conduct Ethiopia has not. And the UN monitoring group has not found any evidence that Eritrea has continued this behavior in the past several years. But for political reasons, mostly centered on the U.S., the sanctions have not been lifted. And the sanctions have a crippling impact on Eritrea's economy.
So you're in a very interesting position on this, because you're basically saying to the Eritreans, look, take more help, engage, open up, and people will maybe help you on your terms, and you can get it done the way you want. But you're presumably going to people in Washington saying, look, re-evaluate Eritrea. It may be doing lots of things terribly wrong, but it could be better if you engaged. So where's the greatest resistance, actually, that you come across, in Eritrea or in the United States?
I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to be completely candid. I would have a hard time saying who is more hard-headed, specific people in the U.S. government or President Isaias. It's tough on both sides. It really is.
Okay, that's quite a striking remark. Farouz, what do you think?
The thing is, you're probably right on some of the points that you've raised. The fact is, Eritrea does need to engage with the communities, and subsequently the US and UK and any other do need to engage with the government as well. But however, what we say is, and this is me as an activist on human rights, is there needs to be human rights dialogue when there is some kind of communication and involvement with the government.
Well, Farouz, I am grateful to you for the pressure that you put on the Eritrean government. It's appropriate, it's valuable. I hope the Eritrean government is listening. My only concern is that it needs to be matched on the diplomatic side with a willingness to engage. And that's what I think is missing. And I think that is what needs to be changed.
Bronwyn Britton, can I ask you this, and perhaps I could put the same point to the Professor. There are lots of countries accused of human rights abuses, and there are lots of countries under sanctions. It's not that unusual. But what does seem, to me, coming to this fairly fresh, utterly amazing about this Eritrean situation, is these people living in Europe are terrified of speaking to us. I mean, it's quite a normal thing. I mean, we speak to refugees the whole time, and no problem. And yet, with this group, they are just frightened, and they dare not speak to us. That does seem extraordinary.
This is one of the things that I just find really baffling, and I can't offer very much in the way of enlightenment here. I don't know what the nature of the Eritrean government's relationship is with the people. On the one hand, you hear things about them being completely and utterly repressed. On the other hand, you know that this is a mostly conscripted army. You know that the government hands out guns to people. You know that Eritreans have fought wars. They know how to use those weapons. And I know that President Isaias walks around Asmara and gets coffee without a bodyguard. I don't believe for a moment that people are making up their fear. But I also think there's a more complex situation going on that I'm able to describe, quite honestly.
I appreciate the fact that you've seen all these positive things on Eritrea as well as Eritreans. But I like to add the fact that you can't speak as a BBC. You can't speak to any newly arrived refugees. There is a great amount of intimidation from the government. If a government has been terrorizing its own population, its own people inside the government, and these people leave their own families to come out, which, by the way, is illegally. When they leave.
To leave the country, you have to do so illegally.
Of course. Yeah. So when they come out and are speaking to the press, they are afraid of their people.
Well, just to pin this down, have you got cases of refugees in, let's say, the UK, who did speak to media organisations, Western outfits, I don't know, Western human rights groups, whatever, and their relatives had problems back home? Does that happen?
We do hear that they've arrested certain persons because they left the country. Not necessarily speak to the press, by the way. They don't get that far. But because they've left the country, their parents have been arrested. But because they left the country, their sisters have been arrested. That we've heard.
The question you are asking them, I mean, you are asking them that they are refugee, they have been persecuted, which they are not. What are they going to tell you? You are asking the wrong question, and because of that, they cannot come to tell lies in front of the camera.
Hang on. You just said something about us. I'll respond. All we asked these refugees and the people who have contact with them is to talk to us about why they left, right? So it's not presupposing that they're political refugees. They may be economic migrants. I wouldn't think that makes a great difference from your point of view, defending the government's record, whether they're coming because they're impoverished or because they're persecuted. But we didn't take a judgment on that. We just said, can you tell us why you're coming? And they said they were too frightened to do so.
But I can make a distinction between persecution and economical
area.
And then the economical side of it can be resolved, by investment, by investing on the country and so on. But the persecution, if it does not exist, you cannot resolve it because it doesn't exist.
I'm sorry, where are the G15? Where are all these?
I'm talking about the people who are coming here, the UK.
So the G15 were the people who were arrested back in 2001?
Yes.
I'm not talking about them, though. My point is the people, you are calling them refugees.
No,
they are Eritrean.
No, sorry. I must emphasise that when we spoke to people, we did not presuppose that they were refugees. They may be economic migrants. They may be refugees. Some have got asylum. They are refugees. Some may not get asylum. They would be economic migrants. My point is we simply asked them, without prejudging the issue of their refugee status, whether they would speak to us, and they're too frightened to do so. You're not really confronting that.
Yeah, the dilemma with them is to get a refugee, you need to say something.
Well, then why don't they come on and
I'm talking about the government, though. To the government, the people who are looking into their case.
Yeah, well, come on. I mean, most refugees.
They need to say. Say, for example, how
it is often said that Syrians
they wouldn't accept you here if you say
that doesn't add up. It is often said that refugees come here and make up bad things about their governments to get refugee status. Your group isn't doing that. They're too frightened to come and even do that.
They are
saying it to the government.
One of the things that I think is interesting, when I've talked to human rights researchers, one of the things I've heard is that if they talk to Eritrean refugees who literally just set foot in Europe, they're often willing to talk. And then when they've been there for a week or two and they've spoken to other members of the diaspora, then they're not willing to talk anymore. I don't know what that means. It could be a number of things. They could be hearing stories of punishment that other refugees have suffered, or they could be realizing that the diaspora is really divided, and they may be reluctant to take a side. I think it could be a lot of different things. As I said, I think
very interesting,
there's complexity at play that we don't understand properly.
You're absolutely right. It might be many of those. However, it might also be the fact that their families will influence them not to speak to the media, or they might go into this life of trying to make it and settle in the UK, and they don't want to do anything. But we have to remember, these people are the people that have wasted so many of their lives given to the national service. They want to come here and start a family or education as soon as possible. So there may be so many things, but I appreciate the fact that you've highlighted those two.
Okay.
We are in the middle, though. We are just forgetting one important.
This is Ahmed Mohammed Mahmoud.
The human traffickers and those who are making money out of the misery of those people. And we see that a lot of stories which is happening in Europe, but we don't see a lot of persecution against those traffickers.
I just wonder if we could do one more thing before we close the programme. And Bronwyn Bruton, I was very struck by your remark that President Isaias can move around freely in his capital with no problems, which, as you basically are pointing out, doesn't fit in with a lot of what's said about the nature of the regime and how it goes and what people are doing there. Now, I mean, of course, it could be just people are too afraid to move against him. Can you talk us through him? You've met him recently, and we'll get everyone's views, because he is a massive figure in Eritrean history and politics. Just give us a little portrait of the man.
I don't know him well, and it would be presumptuous of me to give a portrait of him, I think. One thing that I would emphasize is that I don't think he's ill. I don't think he's unhinged. You hear that a lot from people in the State Department and other governments, and in the opposition as well, this sort of belief that he'll be struck down, so to speak, and removed from the equation. And there's a lot of talk in the State Department and in other places about how, when he goes, and they say the same thing about Mugabe, for example, in Zimbabwe, when he goes, the international community will be able to re-engage with Eritrea. My view is that President Isaias represents a lot of characteristics that are Eritrean. He can be hard-headed. He doesn't like to be told he's wrong. He would rather suffer than lose face. I'm not sure that removing him from the equation, and I'm sorry for that it's an ugly phrase, if for some reason he were to be taken out of the equation, I'm not sure that the situation in Eritrea would be very different. I think we need to bear in mind that if he were to die suddenly, and I really hope it doesn't happen, there would be a power struggle, most likely. The situation in Eritrea could get a lot worse. And my strong view is that regardless of what you think of the current government or of President Isaias personally, you need to engage. We need to engage now. That waiting for something to happen is a foolish strategy that is only going to harm people.
Yes, and he is quite a young man. I mean, given that he's been in power for so long, he's in his late 60s now, I think, so he started terribly young. I mean, he was starting as an EPLF guy very, very, very young. It must have been, I don't know exactly.
In his 20s.
In his 20s, yeah. Mm. So Guillermo Nagash, have you met the man?
Not personally.
Okay, can you just give us your take, sitting in Ohio, and obviously you've come to us with, seeing both sides of the story. What is your take on this man and what his role in Eritrea?
I am not sure if the characteristics that were attributed to the Eritreans in a general way, stubbornness and sense of exceptionalism, are true. But leaving that aside, I think President Isaias had played a role in achieving Eritrea's independence and leading it the first 5 or 6 years in a kind of more stable way. I think what we are talking about now is it is not a question of removing President Isaias or getting away with the system. What I think needs to happen is there needs to be, in combination with the international community, involvement of the Eritrean government, involvement of opposition groups and other interested associations. There needs to be a national conversation which would eventually lead to some kind of reconciliation so that the country can have a peaceful transition. It is not helpful, I would like to say this, it's not helpful either from the side of the Eritreans or foreigners to say, well, the country is okay, he needs to stay. It's not helpful either, he needs to go away. What needs to happen is that the nation needs a national conversation so that eventually we can have a peaceful transition. Thank you.
No, thank you, Professor. And we're hearing the same thing from the United States in a sense. More conversation, more discussion internally and internationally. Ahmed Mohamed Mahmoud, I guess the government may be afraid of doing that. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that's going to happen? Because it hasn't happened in a long time, let's be honest.
Yes. I mean, that's my view, and that's the reality inside Eritrea. I mean, we are, as I said before, we like our freedom, we like our liberation, we like our democracy, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is like the values.
Things, but there hasn't been a vote there hasn't been a vote since '91, is there?
No, the values that we held strongly and which had been bonded and melted while we were fighting this huge enemy is still there and is still thriving. And what I would add to do is like all the freedom fighters, including Isaias Afwerki, they are the salt of earth in Eritrea.
Well, Farouz Waredi, that would include your parents, I think, who were leading independence fighters, and you come from that background. Presumably, did your family have connections with the president?
He was the best man at their wedding.
He was the best man at your parents' wedding, right?
He was.
So, what do you make of the man?
I grew up with Isaias. I've known him as a child. He worked side by side with my father. They were of the same, the central committee. They was part of the central committee, which means they worked together quite a lot. And growing up, I've known him. What I make of him, I don't know. I mean, even before the independence, he managed to imprison my father. So I wouldn't say I was quite young, and I wouldn't say that I've always known that he was a dictator. But I would say that there was an element. It was known among my family, my father, my mother, and and I hear them talking in early days, late 80s, let's say, that there was an issue of power in Isaias.
And that does take us out of time. So I'm very grateful to you all. It is a very, very interesting place, and obviously there are real difficulties there for many young people, but as you're saying, there are possible solutions looking ahead with your various calls for greater engagement from the outside community and internally. If you'd like to hear this programme again, then you can do so. Go to bbcworldservice.com and you'll hear it there. Just search for NewsHour Extra on the search engine there. You can put NewsHour Extra into your podcast provider and get every edition, 1 hour, one topic every week. On Twitter, BBC NH Extra. And emails, you do send emails, and we do appreciate them. We do try to reply to them. BBC NewsHour Extra, all one word, @gmail.com. But that's it for now. So from Ahmed Mohamed Mahmood, Farouz Waredi, Bronwyn Bruton, and Girmay Nagash, thanks very much for your contributions, and thank you for listening. From Owen Bennett-Jones here in London, goodbye.